The gods of Egypt were executed in a single afternoon by a man who believed the sun only spoke to him. For 20 centuries, the people of the Nile had looked to the shadows of the temples for protection, offering prayers to a pantheon that governed everything from the rising of the river to the weighing of the heart in the afterlife. Then, without warning, the temples were bolted shut. The names of the old gods were chiseled from the stone walls. In their place stood a single blinding disk of light, and a pharaoh who claimed that to see the divine, one only had to look at his face. This was the birth of a period of history so unsettling that the survivors tried to burn every trace of it from the memory of the world. To understand the weight of this silence, one must look at the moment Amenhotep IV ascended the throne. At first, he appeared as just another king in a long line of divine rulers, but something within him was shifting. He was not interested in the rituals of his fathers or the influence of the powerful priests of Amun, who held the keys to the economy and the spirit of the nation. He claimed to have received a revelation from the Aten, the physical disk of the sun. It was not a god in the traditional sense. It had no human form, no secret myths, no complex personality. It was a cold, radiant power that demanded absolute exclusivity. This was not a gradual reform. It was a psychological assault on the foundation of Egyptian life. A world where every ancestor ever revered and every ritual performed to ensure a soul's safety was suddenly declared a lie, became the new reality. The pharaoh changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and began a systematic campaign to dismantle the past. He didn't just promote a new religion, he sought to erase the very concept of the old ones. Soldiers and stonecutters were sent across the land, climbing to the tops of high obelisks and descending into the depths of tombs to scrape away the name of the god Amun. It was a war on the written word, a belief that if a name was forgotten, the essence behind it would cease to exist. The trauma of this erasure is difficult to calculate. Families who had spent generations preparing for the afterlife suddenly found their maps to the underworld destroyed. Their protectors vanished. As the old temples fell silent and the priests were stripped of their wealth, Akhenaten realized that the ancient city of Thebes was too haunted by the ghosts of the old gods. He decided to lead his followers into the middle of a barren, scorching desert, to a place where no man had ever built and no god had ever been worshipped. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. It was a city built with terrifying speed, because they could not wait for the traditional large stone blocks to be carved. They used small, portable bricks known as talatat. The city rose like a fever dream from the sand, a sprawling metropolis of white limestone and gold, centered around temples that were open to the sky, forcing the worshippers to stand directly under the punishing glare of the sun. Life in this new city was a radical departure from anything the world had ever seen. The art style of the time, known as the Amarna style, remains one of the most unsettling mysteries of the ancient world. In the statues and reliefs of Akhenaten, the human form is distorted. He is depicted with an elongated skull, a thin, sagging torso, wide hips, and spindly limbs. It was a jarring contrast to the idealized, muscular perfection of previous pharaohs. There is a persistent debate over whether this was a true reflection of a physical condition or a deliberate choice to show that he was neither male nor female, but a vessel for the divine light. To the people living in the shadows of these strange monuments, the pharaoh must have looked less like a man and more like something that had stepped out of a different reality. The atmosphere in Akhetaten was one of forced radiance. There was no room for darkness, no room for the hidden. The king obsessed over the placement of his temples and the composition of his hymns, creating a world where the only path to the divine was through his own bloodline. He was the sole intermediary. If you wanted the sun to rise, you prayed to Akhenaten. If you wanted your children to be healthy, you looked to his image. It was a total centralization of the human soul. Yet while the king sang songs to the light, the empire beyond the city walls was beginning to fracture. The Amarna Letters, a collection of clay tablets found in the ruins, paint a picture of a world in chaos. Governors from the distant frontiers wrote desperate pleas to the pharaoh, begging for troops and support. They spoke of cities being burned, of borders collapsing, and of a rising tide of enemies. But these letters went largely unanswered. The king was preoccupied with his sun disk. He had turned his back on the physical defense of his kingdom to focus on a spiritual transformation that only he truly understood. He was a man locked in a golden cage of his own making, believing that as long as the sun rose over his white city, the rest of the world did not matter. The isolation was not just political. It was a total withdrawal from the responsibilities of a ruler. Inside the city of light, the pressure was mounting. The royal family, Akhenaten, his Queen Nefertiti, and their daughters were depicted in scenes of intimate affection, a rarity for Egyptian art. But behind this mask of domestic bliss, a great sickness began to sweep through the streets. In a society that believed illness was a sign of divine displeasure, the mounting deaths must have been a terrifying omen. The Aten, for all its light, offered no comfort for the grieving and no protection against the dark. The prayers of the people were directed to Akhenaten himself. But if the bridge to the divine was failing to stop the plague, the foundation of his power began to crumble. Then the shadows deepened. Nefertiti, once the most visible and powerful woman in the land, suddenly vanished from the historical record. Theories abound. Some suggest she died of the plague, while others whisper that she took on a new identity, ruling as a co-regent under a male name to help her husband maintain his grip on power. As the years of his reign drew to a close, Akhenaten became more isolated. His city, once a symbol of a new era, was becoming a tomb. When he finally died, he left behind a country on the brink of economic and social collapse, a military that felt betrayed, and a populace that was starving for the return of the gods they had been forced to abandon. What followed was one of the most thorough erasures in human history. The moment Akhenaten's breath left his body, the machinery of the old world roared back to life. His successor, a young boy named Tutankhamun, was quickly pressured by the remaining generals and priests to change his name to Tutankhamun and move the capital back to the old centers of power. The city of Akhetaten was not just abandoned, it was dismantled. The stone was taken to build other monuments, and the desert was allowed to reclaim the streets. The name of Akhenaten was stricken from the king lists. To the Egyptians of the later dynasties, he was simply referred to as the criminal, or that heretic. They wanted to ensure that the memory of the man who tried to kill the gods would be buried forever. For thousands of years, the desert kept this secret. It wasn't until the 19th century that archaeologists stumbled upon the ruins of the lost city and began to piece together the story of the pharaoh who tried to change the world. What they found was a story of a man who may have been a visionary, a man who may have been consumed by his own obsessions, or perhaps a bit of both. He was a ruler who understood the power of belief and the power of the image, using them to reshape reality in his own likeness. But he also proved that a culture's soul cannot be erased without leaving a scar that never heals. The mystery of Akhenaten remains a dark thriller written in the sand. Why did he do it? Was it a calculated political move to strip the priests of their power, or was he truly convinced of his own divinity? The distorted statues, the empty city, and the frantic letters of his dying empire all point to a man who was willing to let the world burn if it meant he could stand at the center of the flame. Even today, when looking at the face of his statues, There is a sense of something alien, something that does not belong to the orderly world of the ancient Nile. He remains a figure of profound contradiction, a poet who wrote beautiful hymns to the light, and a ruler whose vision plunged his people into a generation of darkness. As the sun sets over the ruins of Amarna, the silence is heavy. The temples are long gone, the names of the old gods have been restored to the valley, and the Heretic King is little more than a curiosity in a museum. But the questions he raised continue to haunt the study of history. It is a reminder of how fragile civilization can be when it is tied to the will of a single individual. It is a story of what happens when a leader decides that his truth is the only truth, and that the past is nothing more than a series of names that can be chiseled away. The most chilling part of the legacy of Akhenaten is not what we know, but what we don't. We don't know where he is buried. His tomb was found empty, his sarcophagus smashed into 1,000 pieces. Some believe his body was moved in secret. Others think it was destroyed by those who hated him. Somewhere in the vast, shifting dunes of Egypt, the physical remains of the heretic may still lie, hidden from the light he worshipped so fervently. He wanted to be the only path to the sun, but in the end, he became a shadow. A warning whispered by the wind across a city that was never meant to exist. The gods of Egypt returned, their temples reopened, and their names were spoken once more with reverence. The era of the Aten was treated like a fever that had finally broken, a temporary madness that the nation collectively agreed to forget. But a revolution of the mind is never truly erased. The ideas planted during those 17 years of heresy rippled through the centuries, changing the way humanity thought about the nature of power and the divine. Akhenaten may have been forgotten for 3 millennia, but his attempt to seize the soul of a nation remains the ultimate testament to the terrifying potential of a single obsessive vision. In the quiet halls of the world's museums, the statues of the heretic pharaoh still watch with their narrow, enigmatic eyes. They are the survivors of a war against memory. They represent a time when the sun was a weapon, when a city was a fortress of faith, and when a single man tried to rewrite the laws of heaven and earth. The script of his life was written in the language of light, but it ended in the deep, cold silence of the earth. The desert eventually hides everything, but it never truly forgets. The story of the Heretic King is a reminder that while truth can be hidden under layers of sand, the light eventually finds its way back to the surface, revealing the cracks in the foundations of even the greatest empires. The tension between the king's vision and the reality of his people's suffering creates a narrative of profound tragedy. Those who lived in Akhetaten were part of a grand experiment, one that stripped them of their traditions and replaced them with a blinding, singular focus. The loss of the old gods meant the loss of a personal connection to the divine. The Aten did not listen to the poor, it did not comfort the sick, and it did not guide the dead. It only shone. This coldness, this lack of empathy in the divine mirrors the king's own detachment from his crumbling borders and his dying subjects. When the end came, it was not with a bang, but with a systematic dismantling. Every stone of the great sun temples was carried away. The very ground was cursed. The boy king Tutankhamun was forced to issue a decree, the Restoration Stela, which described Egypt as being in a state of ruin, with the gods having turned their backs on the land. To fix the world, they had to delete Akhenaten. They had to act as if he never existed, and yet the very effort they took to erase him is what makes him so impossible to forget. You do not spend that much energy destroying a man unless you are still afraid of the power he once held. The silence of Amarna is not a natural silence. It is an enforced one. It is the silence of a grave that was meant to stay closed. Every artifact recovered, every piece of jewelry, and every broken statue is a witness to a time when a single man's obsession almost broke the longest-lasting civilization in human history. The Heretic King remains a ghost in the machine of history, a reminder that the most dangerous thing in the world is a man who believes he is the only one who can see the sun. In the end, the sun continued to rise, but it rose over the ruins of his dreams, casting long shadows over a name that was never supposed to be spoken again.